Today we're going to be talking about the NSDA 2021 LD topic. That is, a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. And to analyze this topic, we're going to be looking in two key areas of analysis. Number one, we're going to be looking at how our civil liberties are actually not guaranteed to us constitutionally. And secondly, we're going to be looking at how the government actually has a moral, ethical, legal obligation to protect the whole body of the constituents over the individualistic right, or the individual itself. To begin with, let's talk about the first topic of analysis, that being how our civil liberties are actually not guaranteed to us constitutionally. Looking at what the actual definition of a civil liberty is, we see that civil liberties are also interchangeably called natural rights. What this means is that we're born with civil liberties, or at least we're supposed to be, and these are also referred to as our God-given rights. That being the case, they cannot be given to us or guaranteed to us because they're intrinsically supposed to be with us. Now, going on to the Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to be protecting such rights. However, a civil liberty is not a right. It is a liberty guaranteed to us by birth, whereas a civil right is inherently different. A civil right functions underneath the legal system and the Constitution. A civil right is protected by the Constitution. A civil liberty is actually a protection from the law and from the Constitution. And therefore, when talking about what actually protects us in a legal stance, that would be our civil rights. However, civil liberties are supposed to be protected by the government. However, because they are supposed to be intrinsic, but although they are natural rights meaning they are not given to us, so therefore they can be taken away from us underneath a governmental stance. And they are not guaranteed to us because they are not maintained by a legal aspect. Now, going on, let's look at how, in our next point of analysis, the government actually has a moral obligation to protect the majority, the mass, over the individual. We have what we call a social contract theory, meaning that our rights are being traded with the government for safety. A small bit of the citizens' rights is for safety for rights. And this operates under not only democracies, but also authoritarian regimes. But there is always going to be a contract between the citizens and the governmental body. This is the way that citizens function outside of the state of nature. The state of nature being what was considered the ultimate anarchy, the state of anarchy, where there was no government and it was kill or be killed. So because we operate under the state of nature, we need to have government to protect us and maintain such rights. And for that reason, we see that it is natural only to limit such rights in terms of trying to protect safety. Safety being the number one obligation the government has to its constituents. So today we've looked in two key areas of analysis, how first of all, we are not guaranteed civil rights constitutionally, and secondly, how under the state of nature, in a social contract theory, the government has to protect the citizens first. And for that reason, we can justify limiting civil liberties and a public health emergency. Thank you. Now, for the negation. Today, we're going to be, again, addressing the negation side. I negate the resolved. In a public health emergency, it justifies limiting our civil liberties. Now, to answer why a public health emergency does not justify limiting our civil liberties, we're going to be looking in two key areas of analysis again. Number one, the fact that in a public health emergency, limiting civil liberties is not necessarily going to actually lead to better health of the citizens. And number two, how methods to maintain this public safety in a public health emergency are actually ineffective. To begin with, let's look at our first main point of analysis today. And that is that in a public health emergency, there's no reason to have to limit the civil liberties of the individuals. And the reason why this is because there are viable alternatives to having to force people to do what the government wants them to, in the government's opinion, in terms of what is right during a public health pandemic. Pandemic being the number one public health emergency most people associate. It could also be times of wartime, times of conflict, bioterrorism, but most specifically, when people refer to public health emergencies, we tend to refer to pandemics as the coronavirus pandemic that happened recently. So first of all, when it comes to the government trying to restrict the civil liberty for the sake of supposed safety in a public health emergency, we see that they try to do it by means of things like quarantining, mask mandates, not allowing people to leave their houses, not allowing certain businesses to open, and so on and so forth. However, all this does is not only wreak havoc on the economy, as some people say, but the government does not have to force the individual to do anything, because in fact, what we see is that, again, in the state of the current status quo, I guess you could say, the way that things happen to work out is the citizens want what's best for the society. The society wants to be safe, and the citizens do not have to actually be policed into doing what is right for their own public safety. For that reason, what we see is that The citizens have an exchange of power with the government, and they do not have to be forced to do what is in their best interest for their own health. We see that citizens can actually already follow the guidelines of the CDC, and they can already follow what is in their professional interest based on professionals. We already know what's happening, and we can automatically do what is in our own best interest as the citizen body. And secondly, let's look at how, when it comes to why we should not have to limit the civil liberties of the individual in a public health crisis, what we know to be true is that, again, the alternatives as to how we're going to be making sure people stay safe are not always viable alternatives in the first place. Those things like lockdown and temperature checks and whatnot. What we found in Taiwan was that of the 12,000 people that were first quarantined, only 12 of those 12,000 people actually had the virus. And inevitably, they didn't even get the virus from their day-to-day lifestyles. They got them from being inside and having too much indoor exposure. And all the time, people violate their quarantine. What they found was that people who violate quarantine the most actually happen to be healthcare officials. Therefore, when it comes to stopping the spread of a virus, what we see to be true is that no matter what mandates the government puts in place, it cannot always stigmatize its citizens, no matter how many fines, fees, or regulations are put in place, and therefore the virus is not going to inevitably be stopped simply by these restrictive measures. And for that reason, we can see that it's not justified to limit civil liberties for the state of the public health crisis.